Okay, it's just about 6 o'clock Eastern time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome everybody to the Museum of Discovery and Science Distinguished Speaker Series brought to you by the Save Our Seas Foundation. I'm your host, Brady Newbill, and we're joined tonight by guest Alina Wierczorek, postdoctoral researcher at the Marine Institute, working on her PhD at the National University of Ireland, Galway. I'm going to be talking to her tonight about some of her work on microplastics for the Save Our Seas Foundation. Just a few things before we get started, a few ground rules. If you have not been to any of these events before, or if you have, just a little reminder, we're going to keep everybody's microphones muted just to take out any interference, any background noise, so we can focus all of our undivided attention on our guests. But if you have any questions at any point during the presentation, we encourage you to put your questions in the chat. We'll come around at the end and go over some of those questions with our guests. So again, this is your chance to ask a real scientist. So at any point during the presentation, if you have any questions that come into your head, just put them in the chat and we'll come back around to them at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our special guest tonight, Alina Wierczorek, University of Ireland, Galway, PhD student. Alina, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks very much. Just gonna try and take over the screen there. So, let me know if something's not working there for you, but no.
Looks okay, seeing like your presentation screen.
Oh, you see the actual presentation screen or the preview?
The preview, kind of like with your notes on it and stuff. So if you
okay, sorry, then I have to do that again.
There's probably a button in the share screen that just shows your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Is this happening again? Yeah, sorry, of course. I was trying to switch screens so I should look in the camera. But
no worries.
Is that working now?
Yeah, this looks good.
Okay, perfect. So
Right.
Okay, brilliant. So thanks, Brady, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight and really to learn a little bit about microplastics. So yeah, I hope I can bring you a little bit closer to the work we're doing in this Save Our Seas supported project, which I'm leading together with a big team of people who are actually doing this voluntarily. So I would like to give a shout out to the other people involved as well, because it's a big team and everybody's dedicating a lot of time on this project. So yeah, I want to get started. So today I want to talk to you about microplastics and the interactions they have with the largest fish of our seas. So when I talk about microplastics, it's really the smallest plastics in our seas. And when I talk about the largest fish, I'm talking about sharks, and that's like the whale sharks and basking sharks. So the concept of the project is not only science-based, so we also do a lot of outreach. So we really want to bring the science of the project close to society and also policymakers. So that's one of the great reasons to do these talks as well. And that's why it's great to be here tonight and talk to you about it, because that's actually part of the project we're doing. So today's talk is a little bit like two-parted. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science part and what we're actually doing, but I also want to show you a little bit how we work with the public and kids and policymakers to really drive a change from the findings we're doing. So the idea is to feed these scientific findings directly to people to inspire some change and find solutions to these problems. So like I promised, I'm going to be talking about the smallest plastics. And yeah, again, microplastics are quite ubiquitous in our oceans. So they can be found nearly everywhere, even in the deepest point of our ocean in the Mariana Trench, they've been found. And they kind of cause quite, or they have a an impact on a variety of marine life, from like planktonic organisms to larger organisms. And I might be getting a little bit more into this later today. And when I'm talking about the largest fish, like I said, I'm talking about whale sharks, which can reach actually up to 18.8 meters, and basking sharks, which can reach up to 12.3 meters. And both of these sharks are filter feeders. So that means that they actually feed on planktonic organisms in the water. So teeny tiny little organisms in the water. And they do that by filter feeding. So they swim through the water, and like you see in the picture here, they have their mouth wide open and filter loads of water through their mouth. And then these planktonic organisms get captured in their mouth, and that's what they're feeding on. And whale sharks can filter up to 600,000 liters per hour, and basking sharks can feed nearly or filter nearly 3 times that. So huge amounts of water they're filtering to obtain these planktonic prey, because if you imagine like a shark that big needs quite a lot of energy to support them. So they need to filter a lot of water to get enough energy. But that also means that they potentially get exposed to a lot of plastics in the water while they're filtering the water. So in 2018, this was actually realized as an opportunity to specifically use these charismatic large filter feeders to raise awareness about microplastics. So we all kind of relate a lot to the ocean through these charismatic species, because they're pretty, and there's often stories around them. And if we know that they ingest microplastics, that's kind of having a different impact on us, and then we might get more into the topic. So that's part of the science outreach bit as well. So yeah, today I want to kind of show you how we tackle this science, and also how we try to convey this message. So we work in 2 locations. For the whale sharks, we work in the Maldives. So that's island chain in the Indian Ocean, and in a particular area, which is Digura, where we can find whale sharks all around the year. So we find juvenile whale shark aggregations all year round. And that's one of the only spots on our planet where we can find these aggregations. So it's quite a unique area, actually. And basking sharks, I don't know if you joined in the talk a little bit earlier, you might have heard me talk about that. Where I am right now, we actually 2 hours away from here find huge aggregations of basking sharks on Achill Island, and they show up there in like an area in around May for 2 or 3 weeks. And there's this one bay where we can find, this year we've seen 70 basking sharks. And so these are the 2 study areas, and while they are quite inherently different in terms of the climate and also the political situation in each country, and maybe also the attitude towards the environment, there's also a lot of synergies in these 2 study areas. Both of them are island states. Both of them rely heavily on, the economy relies heavily on our oceans. So in the Maldives, a lot of the economy relies on tourism. So because the Maldives have such a unique marine wildlife, many tourists come there, and a lot of Maldivians live from this money. And in Ireland, we have tourism, but we also have quite a large fisheries sector. So a lot of our economy is based on the sea as well. So it's one reason for us to care about our oceans in these areas. Yeah, and what's also quite related in these 2 areas is that people here are very connected to the ocean. So because we live so close to the sea, we might be a little bit more aware of what's going on in and around us and in the sea. So this is just a little bit of background from where we are working. And now I want to dive into the science part with you. So our scientific aims of the project were to look at quantifying and qualifying microplastics, which we extracted from the feces of whale sharks. And the second aim we have is to explore routes of microplastic exposure. So to actually look at how do these microplastics end up in these sharks. And for that, we do that for the whale and for the basking sharks. And you might wonder how you obtain a fecal sample of a whale shark, and I can tell you it's actually not quite that easy. To obtain 12 samples has taken us since 2015, and it's quite opportunistically. And it was actually one of the people who works on the project with me, Julia, who identified this opportunity while she was in the field and observed one of the sharks releasing their feces. So you can see in the picture there, they actually managed to capture that on video as well. So that is what the samples we're talking about, which they then kind of capture with the mesh, and we look for microplastic samples in those. Julia then sent me on those samples, and I extracted the microplastics here in Ireland. I've worked on microplastics for my PhD thesis, so I knew how to do that, and I also had some idea of how to analyze them. So for this, we use Raman Spectrometry, and we can use a laser to hit the microplastic with and kind of get a good idea of what type of plastic we're dealing with. So first we extract the plastics, and then we analyze what type of plastics we have. And like I said, Julia sent me 12 samples, and here are some examples of the whale sharks. They all have been given names by the NGO we're collaborating with, the Maldives Whale Shark Research Program. And we have samples from, like I said, 12 sharks, and there's some examples of the sharks we have samples from. And in the bottom right corner, you can see the amount of microplastics we extracted from each of these fecal samples. So that ranged from 10 to 20 plastics in just one of those samples. And you also see a picture in the corner there of an example of each of these microplastics. So if you imagine one poo sample of a whale shark has 20 microplastics in it, that's obviously not really bleak news. And when we then looked at the nature of the plastics, we could see that most of them were fibers, which a few years back when we started to look at microplastics was actually quite a surprise to many people that we see so many fibers in our oceans. But now we realize that these fibers are nearly everywhere, and they can shed from like clothing. For example, actually this jumper I'm wearing, this is natural fiber, but there's also these jumpers which are made out of like polyethylene, and they shed when you wash your clothes. And if you don't pre-treat the water to take out these plastics, they end up in the water. And that's one of the hypotheses where these fibers are from. Another source could be fishing gear. And yeah, so these are just some examples where they originate from. We also found some fragments, and just giving you a little bit more detail on those. Yeah, like I said, the fibers can originate from fishing gear or from wastewater. And those fragments, sometimes we found pieces which we could trace back to being originated from computer parts. So other pieces were from like PET, which is commonly used in canisters, and that's something we often see as well in the Maldives being washed up on the beaches. And once they degrade in the sunlight, they fragment more and more into these smaller pieces. So these are the type of plastics we can encounter in those samples. So you might wonder though, what does that actually mean for the sharks? Because they ingest them and they ingest them. So what happens with the shark in between? And that's also really important to know whether or not these plastics are actually dangerous for the sharks. So in general, it is quite hard to study these sharks, as you might imagine. They're large, they're very rare, and they dive. So you cannot really keep them in captivity that well. And you cannot observe them in the open ocean as well, because their movements are way too large, and they're also endangered. So we cannot really trace them down with all we have. So we can make some inferences though from other organisms. And in that case, this is a study done on sea bass, and they were exposed to where they had 3 treatments. One where the sea bass were just kept without any microplastics for their kind of natural diet. Then they had one where they were treating, or where they were adding microplastics into the tanks where the sea bass was kept. And then another treatment where they were adding microplastics, which were covered in pollutants. So that's sometimes we can distinguish in between two types of pollutants, the ones which are in the plastic already, so which make the plastic kind of durable, give it a color, or we can have pollutants from the water being absorbed onto the plastics because they're heavy negatively charged. So they can have like this cloud of pollutants around them. So when you look at these three treatments, these are cross sections of the intestine of the fish. And there we can see that the control, this is what a healthy intestine should look like. In the untreated microplastic exposure, we see that there's kind of some disturbance, there's some inflammation. And then once you have the polluted plastics, that means that there was quite a disturbance to the intestine and a lot of inflammation. So that is obviously bad news for the fish. And if that were the case for these sharks as well, then it probably could have a huge impact on the sharks and their health. So then the other thing you might, or we wondered about as well, is how do these microplastics actually end up in the diet of the shark? And for this, I want to give you a little background also on, I mean, I told you earlier how they're feeding and what they're feeding on, but also their strategy on where they're feeding. So the whale sharks in the Maldives, they do these kind of yo-yo dives. So these are dive profiles there you see at the top on the left in blue. So they kind of stay at the surface, warm up, and then they go down, follow their food, and come back up again. So these are these kind of short yo-yo dives where they go down into the cold water's feet, come back up, warm up. And that's the idea around these yo-yo dives. And then basking sharks in Ireland, they show quite a different pattern where we have, well, actually, I need to maybe explain a little bit here what is stratified and what is frontal. So we have stratified water, which means like the water column is completely mixed. So it's one water mass. Whereas we have frontal water masses, which means you have different water masses meeting, they have different densities, they might be sitting on top of one another. And here we can see that in these stratified waters, they follow the migrations of the plankton, because in stratified waters, the plankton comes up to the surface, eats at night at the surface, and then dives down. And the basking sharks are following exactly the same pattern. And in frontal waters, the plankton is actually behaving, especially Calanus, which is a copepod basking sharks are known to feed on, they're kind of behaving the opposite way. So they go down during the night and come back up to the surface. And we see that basking sharks, again, are feeding, following their prey. So that is quite interesting to know, especially if we think about the exposure and we want to know where the basking sharks and when and how the basking sharks are getting exposed to microplastics. So yeah, there's different ideas behind this. So firstly, they could get exposed to the microplastics through their planktonic prey, and I hope this is going to work. And here you see a little video of these plankton, and in green you see like microplastics, and you can see that they're actually ingesting them. So that means that the plankton might actually already have the plastics inside them, and then when the sharks ingest them, that's how the plastics get inside the shark. Another way the sharks might get exposed to plastics is directly from the water. So we know that there's microplastics concentrations in Ireland and in the Maldives, so they could just directly ingest them from the water, and that's how they could end up inside the sharks. Or thirdly, we have what's called particulate organic matter, and that is where you have organic matter which is in the water. It could be from sloppy feeding or some other organism species, and all that kind of clumps together. And microplastics have been found to actually kind of get incorporated into these clumps. So that's another way the plastics might be ingested through these clumps of matter. So we wanted to look further into that, and we sent out in the Maldives to look at the whale sharks first. That was in 2019. We set out on a 10-day field trip, And the aim was to investigate how these sharks get exposed to microplastics. And we did this on this tiny little boat, actually, which proved a bit of a little logistical challenge. But we went with this tiny little boat around different hotspots where we know that whale sharks are actively feeding. And we took samples there of microplastics with the plankton plankton and microplastics free in the water using this plankton net, which you can see here. And you can see like this plankton sample there being held up against the light. So in there you see all the plankton and potentially some microplastics mixed in there. And then for the particulate organic matter, we commonly take a water sample because that can degrade in the net when you pull it up. So we use these Niskin bottles and they're pretty cool. You can just lower them into the water and there's a little messenger you sent down from the top, and then the bottle snaps shut and we take that water sample and filter it over filter. And then we can look at like the amount of particulate organic matter in there. So this is the kind of samples we took and the locations. We also did day and night profiles, again, to kind of look at where the plankton and the sharks are at what time of the day. We did a night trap at this one location. And actually this one was a really special sample and encounter because all of a sudden we had like this whale shark pop up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. in the morning, swimming around our boat for 3 hours. So that's one of the pictures we actually took there. And we also did these surface trawls. So where we just trawl this plankton net at the surface to get a good surface coverage of the plankton samples. And when we do this work here in Ireland, we had to kind of rethink a little bit because we wanted to do it last year. And I think it was March we wanted to head into the field. So you can all imagine that that wasn't a great timing. And then we wanted to go with a boat. Well, now we still cannot go out in these boats because you cannot have so many people in such a close space. So then we kind of adapted and got these kayaks and are doing this handheld plankton sampling, which is pretty tough because the water can be pretty cold here, especially around me still. But we managed somehow, and we got these samples from actually this location in the west of Ireland. And this is one of the drone footage we took of the aggregations of basking sharks. And our sampling spot is pretty much 10 meters behind this basking shark you're seeing there. So pretty much bang on at the feeding site. And yeah, so we're currently still working on the analysis. So that means we're analyzing what type of plankton is there and also what microplastics we find free in the water. And from the most dominant types of plankton, we take subsamples and look into their stomachs and see if they have plastics inside them. So that will answer whether the exposure happens through the plankton. And then with the seawater and particulate organic matter samples, we just kind of look again whether there's free floating plankton on the filter or plastic on the filter, or whether we have that or particularly high concentration of these plastics in combination with high concentration of this particulate organic matter. So hopefully, eventually we can answer this question of like where the plastics are actually coming from. And why that is important is because if you think of just food webs in the ocean, everything is really based on plankton. So we have like, obviously you have the phytoplankton at the surface, the zooplankton are eating on that, and then you have fish eating on that, and that's the marine food chain. So plankton are at the very basis of that, and all organisms rely on the plankton really. So if they're the ones transferring these plastics into the food chain, it's pretty important to be aware of and has huge consequences, of course, for a whole range of marine species. And I don't want to play you this video, but I will link it into the chat, which is kind of a 10-minute video giving you a little bit more background on the sciencey work and also some footage from the field, so you get a bit of a better idea what all of this looks like. And now I kind of want to move a little bit, like I promised, to, I'm also wanting to give a little time check. Yeah, I think we're still okay. I want to give you a little bit of background also on the science and society and policy interface work we do. So Again, the aims of that are to reach out to society and really explain the science we do and raise awareness, because especially decisions to do with plastic pollution are linked a lot to society. And I think we've seen a great switch in like people changing from like throwaway cups to reusable cups and bringing their own bags. And it's really nice to see that, you know, society is actually willing to do something about this. So it's been quite rewarding work in general. And yeah, then we also had stakeholder engagement workshops. I'm going to get a little bit more into that. And we also work on this global movement. So we have a cinematographer who's like accompanying all this work, and where these little videos are coming from as well. And eventually we want to do a whole documentary with all the findings, which can help to globally reach out about this problem. Sorry, I don't know why. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, again, this is kind of what the outreach in schools looks like. Here again, we're in the Maldives. We're still holding on a little bit, waiting to do it on island. It's still a bit difficult to get into the schools here, but hopefully we're going to get there sooner or later. So yeah, what we usually do is we bring like plankton samples, we show like the scientific gear, and then we explain pretty much what I've been explaining here today. And then we also had what we call the key actors, so people who can actively change some things in the area. So we have local scientists, so we worked a lot with local scientists. We have the tourism sector in the Maldives. So again, this is just the example of the Maldives right now. And we have policymakers. And the way we reached out to these three different key actors was first through a survey, which kind of just got a grasp of what their attitude towards plastics is in general and whale sharks. And then we had a workshop with them where we really kind of framed the problem, talked about the problem, and talked about the problems in finding solutions with them. And what really was great about these workshops is that we were able to bring people together who can make a change and got them talking to one another. It's not that we come there, we provide them the solution and they follow through with it. Unfortunately, it's not that easy, but we got the conversation going. And actually it's really nice to see that since we had done this, actually in the Maldives, they're doing research on it now themselves, and the few small changes have happened, and we keep working with those people as well. Just to give a little glimpse as well of the outcomes of these workshops. So we had the scientists, tourism sector, and policymakers, and they all had, like, in the end, 3 top solutions they would work on. And they're quite different. So we have do and share research. Obviously, that's what the scientists want to do and see as a top priority. Whereas the tourism sector, for example, their top priority was to monitor and find inappropriate waste management and dumping. Policymakers seen education and a ban in single-use plastic. But what was really great to see is that we had a lot of synergies as well. So education was definitely on top of everybody's list. Also a ban and the monitoring of dumping. So now I would like to share with you the video we took about these workshops and kind of messages people gave us in the Maldives. And I hope you can bear with me for a second, where I will try to share this file in. Is that working for you?
That's good. Thank you.
I remember how beautiful the beaches were when I was young, and not much of trash and plastic bottles are seen at that point. But when I start to grow up, it has changed the scenery completely. So that saddens me a lot. Coming generations, as these young ones, don't get to see that beauty now. only from pictures. They think like that the resorts have the best beaches, so we have to go there for picnics. But it's not true. We also had that, but we lost it. We chose, our selfish needs. We didn't see the importance of preserving that.
People really care about their environment, but the thing is, we don't have, for an example, waste segregation. People are not aware about how we are going to segregate the waste, and people are not aware about where the waste they are segregating are going to end up in. It's really sad because we are using, as humans, we are using a lot of plastics, and what we don't know is what actually is the impact of these plastics. We don't know much about what we have as biodegradable plastic bags, which are creating a lot of microplastics, but people are not aware about these kinds of things. So it's very important to conduct awareness sessions for locals involving a lot of international organizations, which will make them believe that plastic is a problem in the community.
Microplastics can be a threat to a lot of animals, and we've seen that in other animals as well. So it could cause problems with hormones and genetics. But as for whale shark, currently we do not know. So that's the reason we are trying to get this study done.
A lot of the times, even when you gather samples, the analysis is not possible in Maldives because we simply don't have the equipment, so it needs to be sent overseas. And for this reason, I think most of these studies are actually done overseas. It doesn't really come to Maldives. It doesn't reach policymakers, or it doesn't reach the general public. Maybe it is accessible, but we're not sure how to access it. So there's a communication barrier, I would say.
In the Maldives, there hasn't been much of research on the issue of especially microplastic and its association with megafauna. The research that you have presented today gives a new insight on how to move forward with this issue. I'm sure the policymakers can, from these findings, can find better solutions, what kind of actions that needs to be taken in order to tackle this issue.
It's very important for policymakers and local authorities to implement such actions like elimination of water bottles. Water bottles are one of the major plastic usages in the Maldives.
We don't really need this dependency on plastic bottles. We have perfectly fine desalinated water that's coming out of taps in Maldives. So that is something that we are trying to communicate with the general public.
Educating that the water is drinkable and proving that the water quality is good enough for people to drink, then I believe, and I'm pretty sure, the amount of bottles, the PET bottles we have will be reduced.
We started bringing the glass bottles to avoid any type of plastics into ICYMI. That is my target, but it's not only using the glass bottles. The important thing is to stop bringing the plastics.
At the moment we are doing massive changes, and all the guest rooms we remove all the plastic bottles, and all the outlets we don't have now, we are using our glass bottles, and we produce all the waters in the resort itself. So in a way we will be stopping 100%. 100% is not possible, but almost 99% plastic.
When we start, we cannot afford to bring the bottles again.
We can put an end to this, and it takes a lot of advocating and spreading the knowledge over the years and cleanups. And that's why I feel like doing cleanups is a very good thing, especially for the younger generation. So if you start at a younger age, the whole generation will realize this is a big problem, and it will hopefully get better in the future.
One plastic straw takes about 100 to 200 years to break down in the ocean. We want to see how is the water at different depths, no? Because we study the whale shark at different depths. Okay?
The education is the only the better way. From the beginning, we can teach them. It is our environment. So it's our responsibility to stop the marine pollution. Marine litters and everything, marine pollution, drainage, dumping waste into the ocean, everything, it's our responsibility.
Number one in the industry is in Maldives is tourism, and tourism is the industry which creating a lot of jobs. And a lot of students are coming for jobs, and so it will be advantage for them also. If they are not aware today, and tomorrow will be not bright for us.
If we want to, look for a better future, we need to go green with Digra. This is good for the people who are living here. They will be proud, after some times when the media announced that Digrang is a plastic-free island.
All of together, I mean, as a team, that only we can do something.
There is still hope. We can still change that. But yes, comes at a cost, but it's not much. It's not a huge price to pay.
The only thing left to send you off with now, or to leave you with, is a big thanks to all the people involved, like the whole team who's based in the Maldives, the NGO we're working with, the Maldives Whale Shark Research Program there, all the people we have here in the community who basically tell us when the basking sharks come into the bay, and yeah, all the institutes and foundations like Save Our Seas Foundation who support us, and also some industry like Olympus and Waterless. So if you want to kind of follow on, I've put some Twitter account up there, and yeah, I put the links to the videos in the chat now, and I'm curious to hear your questions.
Okay, great, excellent. Thank you, Alina, for that very informative presentation. I think to start with the questions, again, it's still time to ask questions. If you have any, throw them in the chat and we'll get to them. It's time for our discussion time here. So I think first thing to address, based on some of the questions coming in and based on some of the questions I have, a lot of us were surprised to hear the source of a lot of microplastics being in our clothes and being the fibers in our clothes. So Dawn is asking, are there certain fabrics that shed more or less, or what? And you also mentioned something about treating your clothes at some point too. So just kind of a general, like, what can we do about that? Are there certain materials of clothes that are better or worse than others, and is there something we can do when doing the laundry that can help prevent that?
Yeah, it is actually a really interesting question, and something which struck us from, I think, maybe 7 years back when I started working on this. Kept finding these fibers, and it really has become really a separate issue because it's obviously also the clothing industry, and we see some companies working towards this, which means some companies recycle it, but of course there's still the danger of it ending up in the ocean. But there's definitely certain types of fabric which shed more, again, like these polyethylene clothes, cheaply produced clothes often tend to shed more. It also has to do a lot with the washing machine. So there's different filters in washing machines. I once got an email from someone who used to design washing machines, and he told me that years back they had a filter which filtered out these fibers and they were taken out. And now they're obviously looking, and like companies are looking and putting them back in. So yeah, there's two things being done from the industry side, water treatment as well, washing machine companies obviously. wastewater effluent is definitely a big problem. But in terms of what people can do is, yeah, look at your clothes, look at your label. Definitely go for natural fibers where you can. I know sometimes it's not possible. I find it really hard. I'm struggling a lot to find natural fiber clothes. So, but yeah, slowly working towards that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just anytime I get into learning about this topic or any topic related to plastic pollution or anything like that, is just, there's always something that I would have never thought of that's just super obvious like that. So that's a really good one to keep in mind. We're always looking for things that connect us to the issues, and that's definitely one of them. Sana is asking, could you go over again the difference between outside and inside polluted plastics, as it was mentioned in the slide about sea bass?
Yeah, so when a plastic is produced, we have like these virgin pellets. So that is basically the pure plastic. And then companies add different things such as flame retardants to it. So plastics actually catch fire quite easily, but for safety reasons, to prevent it, they put flame retardants in it. But these flame retardants, they are highly toxic. Some of the chemicals added actually even have been found to have caused hormonal changes, or have triggers which act on hormones in our own bodies as well. So that's what's inherently in the plastic. So again, one thing companies can mind is, what do I actually need to put in the plastic? And what does it actually cost, and being more aware of that. And then the plastic itself is negatively charged. So that means when it enters the water, it's, just to give an example of that, if you rub a balloon on your hair, you've probably done that before, and you see the hair standing up. So that's a good example of charge, you know? So if you imagine this analogy of the balloon being in the water like that, and like attracting things towards it. So that's what it's like. And so when it's in the water, and the water has pollutants in it and quite low concentrations, which might not be so harmful, this particle is attracting these pollutants because it's drawing them towards them. So then the plastic is all of a sudden has a much higher concentration than the free pollutants in the water. So that is something which causes a bit of debate. Some people say it's not that important, and then other people say it's quite significant. So again, it's quite a new, I think microplastics have kind of really just jumped up into scientific research, or have really made their breakthrough in sort of scientific research in the last 10 years. So that's something which people are currently looking at, like how much does this effect actually account for?
Yeah, definitely seems like there's plenty to learn in that field of research. I've learned like 5 things that I would have never thought of in the last like 2 minutes. One of which was just considering what the ingredients of the actual plastic are. And so something like that flame retardant thing. And the other thing about just attracting other pollutants. So saying that if there's scattered microplastics throughout one patch of the ocean and it picks up other pollutants, like let's say here in Florida, we have an issue with algae blooms coming from runoff from the lakes, not getting filtered through the Everglades, and we get these big red tide blooms and cyanobacteria blooms. Do those stuff like that, could that be kind of like, not magnetized, but attracted to the plastics and concentrated in an area? Is that what you're saying?
Well, algae, I don't actually know whether they might, like, there's definitely something which is a biofilm. So that's again another dimension towards that. So when the plastic is in the water, it not only attracts pollutants, like free-flowing pollutants. So that's just, it could be metals, for example, or
gotcha.
Yeah, these kind of things, which can be harmful. But then you can also look at algae and biofilm, and then again, the biofilm itself might cause it to attract more pollutants. So it's quite, it's sometimes not that straightforward. But yeah, that's actually what one of my colleagues from my PhD is looking at. She's looking at biofilms and how they cause, like, or attract metals to the plastics and where they are located within that biofilm as well. So.
CC is asking, how do we help clean microplastics that are already in the ocean? And my first, maybe it's a sci-fi thing, maybe it's a future thing. Would that be helpful, that microplastics attract other pollutants and get a lot of unnatural pollutants in the same place? Or would that just kind of be, like I said, like sci-fi thinking?
So yeah, you mean how can we get the plastics out of the ocean, or?
Yeah, I mean, the main question is how do we get plastics out of the ocean? And I kind of wanted to add to that if the way that microplastics tracks, is that helpful or no difference at all?
So getting plastics out of the ocean, once they're there, it's very difficult. And I mean, maybe you have heard of the ocean cleanup, but it's quite a controversial project because it is fishing plastics from the surface using this big mesh out in the open ocean. But we don't only find plastics there, we also find loads of different other organisms. So when you sweep up large amounts of plastics, then you potentially could also sweep up these organisms. So you have to be really careful in designing these solutions, and that's what they're working on, obviously. Again, there's a bit of debate about how helpful that is. I think personally, in my opinion, is working at the source. So rivers, for example, are a really big source, and that's also something the ocean cleanup is doing right now. They kind of switched a little bit from working in the open sea to working at the source. And there's been another project, it's lovely to follow on Twitter, it's called Mr. Trash Reel. And that was an early version of what they had in the ocean cleanup. So it's like this thing collecting plastics entering the ocean from like river influx. So that's probably good, working at the source and preventing the plastics from getting into the ocean. But once they're out there, it's a really complex system. They break up more and more. Ocean cycling, we have a grasp of it, but we're not really there. We don't even understand fully sometimes what's going on. So these plastics are cycling through, they're interacting with organisms and matter. And that also partially answers your question, because once you have these films on there, these plastics can travel, and then whatever is on the plastic travels to these environments. Could be the deep sea. So yeah, and what it does there is another question. It could be good, but it could be bad. And yeah, something again people are looking at right now. But
yeah, that's I mean, absolutely, and that kind of touches on another thing that I had never thought of is plankton eating microplastics, because you would picture that being like what type of, but as the plastic breaks down, it becomes more and more micro. Yeah, so plankton eating that, and then it's just a part of the food chain already, whether or not. So that really blew me away also.
There's also a study actually done on krill where they show that krill ingest microplastics and break it down even more, so it turns into even smaller fragments. So yeah, everything what's in the ocean is going to interact with it to some degree or another.
Yeah, that's a tough cycle to stop once it's in motion. Dawn's asking a great question. Are microplastics more concentrated at the surface then? Or
that was kind of what was traditionally always the idea, is like, okay, they have a low buoyancy, so we all find them at, there's like this carpet of microplastics on the surface. And the more we look into it, we see that, yeah, they get ingested by plankton, and plankton travel like through different layers. They do like this diurnal migration. I worked on deep sea fish, so they eat at the surface and then they dive down to like 1,000 meters. And what happens if they release the plastic there? I don't think it's going to go back to the surface. So then it's down at that depth. So yeah, again, it's all just, I think it's really important to understand what a complex system we're working with, because many people tend to just look at the ocean and see the surface. So we're dealing with that. And that was also part of the survey we had. We asked people, where do you see plastics? And no one would say we see it in the deep sea, because they've never seen pictures of it. They've never actually seen it. So it's our perception of the thing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. I can't say that I've ever seen plastic in the deepest part of the ocean either, because I've never been there. So yeah, a lot of ground to cover there. Sana is asking if you could clarify what you meant by the difference between stratified and frontal water.
Yeah,
a little earlier.
it's a bit of a tricky one. Should have maybe put up a picture. So stratified just means like the water is really well mixed, and that's usually like in the open ocean we have stratified water. So that means there's one water mass which has the same property, so the same temperature, or it has like a temperature gradient from the surface to the deep, slowly, where it has similar salinities, this kind of things. So salinity is how salty the water is. When we have frontal waters, that means that we have different water masses maybe sitting on top of each other. So there's like a less dense and a more dense layer, and they kind of just sit on top of each other, and they have a bit of like different properties. So that's why the organisms interact different with these water masses as well, because some of those water masses might be more nutrient rich as well. So then they follow the nutrients. What's interesting in the Maldives, for example, there we have upwelling. So we have like the reef and steep drop off, and like nutrient rich cold water hitting that reef, and that gets pushed up. And that's why that is such an amazing area for wildlife as well, because they start feeding on this water, then nutrient rich water.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, again, yeah, just kind of talking about the different bodies of water coming from different currents, upwelling coming from the bottom. The ocean is a very dynamic system for anybody out there.
This is one of the main messages.
Constantly in motion, yes.
Yeah.
Aiden is asking, so what are the long-term effects of microplastics on the health of the sharks and the whale sharks that you're studying?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't think we will be able to answer it really, because we cannot do experiments on them because they're so precious, and we wouldn't want to do that, of course. And we cannot follow them through the ocean and see what's happening. But again, we can just see what's happening to other species. Also, there's been some research who took tissue samples of, I think, whale and basking sharks, and they found plasticizers. So again, what's being added to plastics in their tissue. So that means that those get actually absorbed by the shark. So what that does, for some of those plasticizers, we kind of know what they do or what they might be doing. Again, interactions with hormones, they might trigger things in your body. And so, yeah, we're slowly finding more and more out about these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's, yeah, it might be difficult to diagnose a whale shark then, but we all definitely appreciate you for trying. So we're only got a few minutes left. I think I've gotten to everybody's question for the most part. So I just kind of like to touch in and ask kind of what I ask everybody at the end here about, how did you get into what you do? And, and then what are some things that the folks watching can do to help the issue?
I think the reason why I got into microplastics was, actually, I have a really funny career path, maybe, because I'm from Germany originally. And when I was in Germany, I studied graphic design. I was going down that path, and then I wasn't entirely happy with that. So I took a bit of time out, and I went to South America, and I worked with sea turtles. And that was pretty shocking, because we find these stranded sea turtles really bloated, so they can't really dive down anymore. And we tried to take care of them. Sometimes they pass away under our care, and we dissect them after to try and find out what happened. And most of the time they were just completely stuffed with plastics. So kind of on that note, I went to save the seas and wanted to pursue a career in marine science. And I started and did my PhD in that area, kind of working on some other issues now with deep sea fish as well. But yeah, so that's, I guess, how I addressed it. But it's a challenge, and I wouldn't recommend everybody to immediately drop their job. And it's definitely not an easy job as well at times. But what everybody can do, I think, with this kind of issue, it's quite easy for everyone to interact with it, which is really nice about it. For example, climate change can be quite intimidating. It's hard not to use your car. It's really harsh, but it might be easier especially when they're remote, but it might be easier to, you know, kind of check the label of your clothes, see if you can go to the market, get your food there, rather than go to the supermarket, get everything packaged. These kind of small changes, I think they really have an impact. And they also do really positive things for yourself. They kind of really empower you. Like when you do these things, you know, every time you do them, you kind of feel better about yourself. And sometimes it's tough, especially when you forget a bag when you go to the supermarket and you walk out with your shopping like this because you don't want to buy a bag. But, you know, yeah, just small steps. And I think I've been really amazed with how people are interacting with plastic pollution and how generally people are starting to interact a lot more with the ocean in general. So just inform yourself, educate yourself, educate your kids. I think it's always really good as well.
Absolutely. Education is a great first step in any issue, especially one like this, because it's like, I will now think about that every time I buy clothes, everything, and just kind of knowing all those things, you'll take it into mind and make more wise decisions. So we're just about out of time. I want to once again thank our guest, Alina Wierczorek at the University of Ireland, Galway, for speaking with us tonight, and for all the work she's doing studying microplastics and their impact on the environment. Alina, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And this is also, for fans of the show, this is the furthest distance I think we've ever talked to somebody. So Alina is in Ireland right now, which is a 5-hour time zone from us here in Florida. We want to thank her also for her diligence and having a nice late night session with us.
No problem.
About midnight over there, so we're gonna wrap this up now. So thank you again. And for those of you want to keep in touch, want to help, actually in a couple weeks, we're having a beach cleanup at Von D. Meisel Eula Johnson State Park, hosting one of our beach cleanups there in Dania Beach. That's going to be on August 21st from 8 to 11 a.m. And then stay tuned for next month's Distinguished Speaker Series sponsored by Save Our Seas Foundation. We're going to be talking about manta rays with Dr. Guy Stevens and Emily Humble of the Manta Trust. And thank all of you for joining us. As always, please come and see us at the Museum of Discovery and Science whenever you get a chance. We'd like to thank the Save Our Seas Foundation for making this possible tonight. And again, thank you all for joining us. Have a lovely evening. I'm Brady Newbill signing off, and we'll see you next time.